In this segment, we're going to be taking a look at the emergence of modern America from the period of 1877 through the 1930s. Today, we're going to focus primarily on what factors influenced American growth and expansion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was things like economic opportunity, it was industrialization, it was technological change, and immigration that fueled American growth and expansion. As we look at westward movement, following the Civil War, westward movement intensifies into the vast region between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. This westward movement included the years immediately before and after the Civil War, where the era of the American cowboy, marked by long cattle drives over hundreds of miles, influenced by open land in the West, and that was the only way to get cattle to the market. And this age, right after the Civil War, when the American cowboy really came into fruition, marks the beginning of modern America. Also, when we consider westward movement, many Americans had to rebuild their lives after the Civil War. They moved west, and they took advantage of this thing called the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, this gave free public land to settlers who would agree to work on it for 5 years, and they were given 160 acres. This is going to help populate the West as well as get the land working for economic reasons. Much like the old indentured servants, these people are going to be given an opportunity at little cost to themselves. When we consider another element of this westward movement, Southerners and African Americans in particular moved west to seek economic opportunities after the Civil War. They often settled in places like Kansas and Nebraska. Called exodusters, many settlers settled in these areas as they left the South looking for a better life further west. New technologies, for example, the railroads, the mechanical reaper, opened up new lands in the West for settlement, and that made farming more prosperous. After all, if it's not prosperous, Americans are not likely to do it. By the turn of the century, the Great Plains and Rocky Mountain region of the American West was no longer unsettled frontier, but it was fast becoming a region of farms and ranches and towns. At the same time that Americans are moving west, new Americans are moving here as immigrants began to flock to America. When we consider the immigration prior to 1871, this is what we would call the old immigrants. Most immigrants to America from this period came from Northern and Western Europe, countries like Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, Norway, and Sweden. However, in that period from 1871 until 1921, the new immigrants were coming. These immigrants were primarily coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, from places like Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, and present-day Hungary and Yugoslavia, as well as from Asia, China, and Japan. These new immigrants were different from the old immigrants. They looked different, they sounded different, they acted different, and their foods were different, and so were their customs. These new immigrants who were coming to America, like earlier immigrants, were seeking freedom and better lives for themselves and their families. The new immigrants often settled and made valuable contributions, and they built America during this period. They faced hardships and hostility. There was fear and resentment. However, they helped to build things like our factories, the Transcontinental Railroad, textile mills, steel mills, and the clothing industry in New York City, and the Italians and the Slavs also would work in the coal mines. These new immigrants during this period came from Europe, and they entered through Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Their first view of America was often the Statue of Liberty, standing nearby as their ships arrived following that long voyage across the Atlantic. They immediately began the process of assimilation, that is, joining a new culture into what is termed the American melting pot. The idea that America is made of immigrants from all over the world, creating a special type of mixture that is purely American. They often settled in their own ethnic neighborhoods in these growing cities. Children worked hard to learn English, to adopt American customs, and to become American citizens. Public schools are going to serve as a very important role in this process of assimilation as immigrants joined our society. But again, despite these valuable contributions made to the building of America during this period, immigrants faced hardships and a great deal of hostility. There was fear, there was resentment that these immigrants would take jobs for lower pay than American workers, and there was a great deal of prejudice based on religious and cultural differences. Nativism, that hatred of these immigrants, began to take a toll. Mounting resentment led Congress to limit immigration, first with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, followed by the Immigration Restriction Act of 1921. These laws effectively cut off most immigration to America for the next several decades. However, the immigrants of this period and their descendants continue to contribute immeasurably to American society. As they settled in these cities, we get this thing called urbanization, which means the growth of cities. As the nation's industrial growth continued, cities such as Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York grew rapidly as manufacturing and transportation centers. The factories in the large cities provided jobs, but the workers' families often lived in very harsh conditions, settling into crowded tenements and slums. The rapid growth of these cities caused severe housing shortages and the need for new public services, such as water and sewage, such as public transportation. And the city of New York began construction on the very first subway system. By the end of the century, many cities had built trolley cars and streetcar lines, much like the city of Richmond. Admission of new states continued as the population moved westward. Many new states in the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains were added to the Union. By the early 20th century, all of the states that make up the 48 continental United States, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, had been admitted to the Union. America had grown full, and now it's time to grow within.